Fading Portraits. Chapter 1. The House of Portraits. The Weiss family lived in a large estate in Bavaria, surrounded by forests and hills that seemed to hold secrets of their own. The house was old, built of stone that had darkened with age, and its long corridors carried the silence of centuries. The walls were covered with portraits of ancestors, each painted with careful detail, showing faces that once carried pride and dignity. These portraits were not only decoration. They were symbols of the family's history, reminders of the bloodline that had survived through wars, hardships, and time. Eleonora Weiss, at 36 years old, was the keeper of the estate. She had taken responsibility after the death of her parents, and she carried the weight of tradition with quiet strength. She believed that the portraits were more than art. They were guardians of memory, and she felt it was her duty to protect them. Thomas Weiss, her older brother, lived in the estate as well, though his view of the portraits was different. At 40 years old, he was a man shaped by skepticism. He respected the family's past but did not believe in mysteries or curses. To him, the fading of the paintings was only the result of time, of dust and age. Yet even he could not ignore the strange changes that began to appear. The colors of the portraits grew weaker, the faces blurred, and details that had once been sharp became shadows. Thomas tried to explain it with reason, but deep inside he felt unease. He had always dismissed the whispers of supernatural forces, but the silence of the house began to feel heavier, as if the walls themselves were watching. Clara Weiss, the youngest of the family, was 18 and full of restless dreams. She longed for freedom, for life beyond the estate, for adventures that would take her far from the heavy traditions of her family. Yet she was bound to the house, tied by the expectations of her aunt and uncle, and by the strange presence of the portraits. Clara often walked through the corridors, staring at the fading faces. She felt a connection to them, though she did not understand why. When she looked at her own portrait, painted only a few years earlier, she noticed that the colors seemed weaker than before. Her face was not as clear. Her eyes seemed less alive. Fear touched her heart, though she tried to ignore it. She wondered if the portraits were not only fading but pulling something away from her, something she could not name. The estate grew colder as the days passed, and the fading of the portraits became impossible to deny. Eleonora watched with worry, Thomas with doubt, and Clara with fear. The family began to sense that the paintings were not ordinary objects. They carried a presence, a weight that pressed against them. The fading was not natural. It was deliberate, as if the portraits were erasing the people they represented. The house, once a place of pride, became a place of unease. The silence of the corridors was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, filled with the fear that something was being lost. The Weiss family lived in an old estate, where the walls were covered with portraits of ancestors. But the paintings began to fade, faces disappeared, and fear grew inside the house. The first signs of danger had appeared, and though none of them understood the full meaning, they felt that the portraits were more than art. They were part of the family's fate, and their fading was the beginning of a trial that would test them all. Chapter 2. First Disappearances. The fading of the portraits soon became more than a strange detail on the walls. Eleonora Weiss, who had always taken care of the estate with discipline and devotion, began to notice changes that reached beyond the paintings themselves. At first it was small, almost invisible. A name written in the family records seemed lighter than before, as if the ink had lost its strength. A letter that once carried the handwriting of an ancestor appeared incomplete, with words missing as though they had never been written. Eleonora felt unsettled, but she tried to believe it was only the effect of time. Yet as the days passed, the signs grew stronger, and she realized that the fading portraits were connected to something far more dangerous. One morning she walked through the library, where shelves were filled with books and documents about the family's history. She reached for a record that had always been there, a book that listed the names of relatives who had lived in the estate. When she opened it, she saw that one name had vanished completely. The space was blank, as if no one had ever existed in that place. She remembered the person clearly, remembered their face and their story, but the book denied their existence. She searched other papers and found the same emptiness. The belongings of that relative, once kept in a chest, were now meaningless objects, stripped of identity. Eleonora felt fear rise inside her, for she understood that the portraits were not only fading. They were erasing lives. Thomas Weiss noticed the changes too, though he tried to explain them with reason. He believed that memory could fail, that papers could be damaged, and that objects could lose meaning with time. But even his skepticism began to weaken when he saw that people who had once been spoken of in the village were no longer remembered. Neighbors who had known the family for years acted as if those relatives had never existed. Their names were gone from records, their stories erased from memory. Thomas felt a chill as he realized that the fading portraits were not only destroying images. They were destroying reality itself. He struggled to hold on to logic, but the silence of the estate and the emptiness of the records forced him to face what he had denied. Clara Weiss felt the changes in a different way. She was young, full of dreams, and she often thought about leaving the estate to find freedom. But as she walked through the corridors, she noticed that her own portrait seemed weaker than before. The colors of her face were fading, her eyes less clear, her presence less alive. She felt a strange emptiness inside herself, as if parts of her memory were slipping away. She tried to recall moments from her childhood, but some details were missing, replaced by shadows. Clara realized that the fading portraits were not only erasing the past. They were reaching into the present, pulling pieces of her life away. She felt trapped, bound to the curse that lived in the walls of the estate. Eleonora watched her niece with worry, and she knew that the danger was growing. The fading portraits were not only symbols of history. They were instruments of destruction, slowly erasing the family from existence. She understood that if nothing was done, they would all vanish, forgotten by the world, erased from memory and reality. The estate, once a place of pride, had become a place of fear. The silence of the corridors carried not peace but warning. The first disappearances had begun, and the Weiss family stood at the edge of a mystery that threatened their very lives. Eleonora noticed that people shown in the portraits started to vanish in reality. Their names were erased from papers, their belongings became empty, and their presence was forgotten. The fading was no longer only on canvas. It was spreading into the world, and the family understood that the curse was real. The first disappearances were only the beginning, and the danger ahead would demand courage they had never imagined. Chapter 3. The Family's Secret. Thomas Weiss had always believed that the estate was only a house, a place built of stone and wood, carrying the weight of history but nothing more. He had dismissed the whispers about curses and spirits as old tales meant to frighten children. Yet as the portraits continued to fade and the first signs of disappearance spread through the family records, his skepticism began to weaken. He spent long nights in the library, searching through shelves filled with dusty books and boxes of forgotten papers. The silence of the estate pressed against him, and the flickering light of the candles made the shadows seem alive. He felt that the answers were hidden somewhere in the archives, waiting for him to uncover them. One evening he opened a chest that had not been touched for decades. Inside were letters, journals, and fragments of parchment written by ancestors who had lived in the estate long before him. As he read, he discovered words that spoke of a curse, a secret that had been passed down but never spoken aloud. The records explained that the portraits were not ordinary paintings. They were tied to the souls of the family, created with a ritual that bound life to canvas. The ancestors had believed that this bond would preserve their memory forever, ensuring that no one in the bloodline would be forgotten. But the writings also carried warnings. The bond was fragile, and if the portraits began to fade, the souls themselves would weaken. Life would be erased, not only from memory but from reality. Thomas felt a chill as he read these words. He remembered how names had vanished from the records, how belongings had lost meaning, and how even neighbors had forgotten people who once existed. The curse explained everything. The fading portraits were not simply art losing color. They were the slow destruction of the family's existence. He realized that the Weiss bloodline was trapped in a dangerous pact, one that had promised eternal remembrance but had instead brought the threat of erasure. The more he read, the more he understood that the family had lived under this shadow for generations, pretending that the portraits were symbols of pride while hiding the truth of their power. Eleonora listened carefully when Thomas shared what he had found. She had always felt that the portraits carried more than beauty, but now she knew that her duty as keeper of the estate was heavier than she had imagined. She understood that protecting the portraits was not only about preserving history. It was about protecting life itself. The fading was not a simple problem of age. It was the sign of a curse that demanded attention. Eleonora felt fear, but she also felt determination. She had promised herself that she would protect the family, and now she knew that the battle was not against time but against darkness. Clara, though young and restless, felt the truth of the curse in her own heart. She had seen her portrait lose color, and she had felt pieces of her memory slip away. The records explained what she had feared. Her soul was tied to the canvas, and if the portrait disappeared, she would vanish too. Clara realized that her dreams of freedom were bound to the fate of the family. She could not escape the estate until the curse was broken. The knowledge filled her with both despair and strength. She understood that her life was not only her own. It was part of a chain that connected her to generations before her, and that chain was now threatened. Thomas found old records speaking of a curse. The portraits were tied to the souls of the family, and when they faded, life itself was erased. The secret was revealed, and the Weiss family understood that they were living under a shadow that had been created long ago. The curse was real, and the fading portraits were not only symbols of history but instruments of destruction. The family now faced the truth. Their survival depended on uncovering the full story of the portraits and finding a way to break the bond before it erased them completely. Chapter 4. Struggle with Darkness. The estate grew heavier with silence as the curse revealed its strength. Clara Weiss, once full of restless dreams and youthful hope, began to feel her own identity slipping away. She would wake in the morning and forget small details about herself, such as the sound of her laughter or the memory of her favorite places in the village. At first she thought it was only tiredness, but soon she realized that her portrait was changing. The colors of her face had grown pale, her eyes on the canvas were fading, and her outline was turning transparent. Clara felt fear rise inside her, for she understood that the portrait was not only a painting. It was a mirror of her soul, and the fading meant that she was being erased piece by piece. Eleonora Weiss watched her niece with deep concern. She had always carried the duty of protecting the family, but now she saw that the danger was not distant. It was inside the house, inside the very walls that had once been symbols of pride. Eleonora felt the weight of responsibility pressing against her heart. She knew that if Clara vanished, the family line would weaken further, and the estate itself might lose its meaning. She tried to remain strong, but the sight of her niece forgetting herself filled her with sorrow. Eleonora understood that the portraits were not only fading with time. They were consuming the lives of those they represented, and the curse was stronger than she had imagined. Thomas Weiss struggled with his own thoughts. He had always been a skeptic, refusing to believe in supernatural forces, but the evidence was now undeniable. He saw the records erased, the belongings emptied, and his niece losing her memory. He could no longer explain these events with reason. The curse was real, and the portraits were its instruments. Thomas felt anger at the ancestors who had allowed such a pact to be made, binding the family to darkness in exchange for remembrance. He realized that his skepticism had blinded him, and now he had to face the truth. The struggle was not only against fading paint. It was against a force that lived in the estate, a force that demanded the family's existence as payment. The three of them began to understand that they had no choice but to uncover the full truth. The fading portraits were not only symbols of history. They were chains that bound the family to a curse that erased life itself. Clara's fading face was a warning that the curse would not stop until all of them were gone. Eleonora felt determination grow inside her, stronger than fear. She knew that the family had to act, to search deeper into the past, to uncover the origin of the portraits and the darkness that had created them. Thomas, though shaken, accepted that his role was to help, to use his knowledge and strength to fight what he had once denied. Clara, though weak, understood that her survival depended on courage, and she tried to hold on to the fragments of memory that remained. Clara began to lose her memory of herself, her face on the portrait turning transparent. The family understood that they had to uncover the truth, or they would vanish completely. The struggle with darkness had begun, and the Weiss family realized that their fate was tied to secrets hidden in the estate. They knew that only by facing those secrets could they hope to survive, and the path ahead would demand more strength than they had ever imagined. Chapter 5. Discovery of Truth. Eleonora Weiss searched the estate with growing desperation, knowing that the fading portraits were not simply decoration losing color but something far more dangerous. She had always felt that the house carried secrets, and now she was certain that the answers were hidden in its forgotten corners. One evening she entered a locked room that had not been opened for many years. Dust covered the shelves, and the air smelled of age and silence. She found a small wooden chest, carved with symbols she did not recognize. Inside the chest lay a diary, its pages yellowed but still strong. The handwriting belonged to her great-grandmother, a woman whose name had been spoken with respect but whose life had always seemed surrounded by mystery. Eleonora opened the diary and began to read, her heart heavy with expectation. The diary told a story that explained the curse. It spoke of an artist who had come to the estate many generations earlier, a man whose talent was admired but whose soul was touched by darkness. He had offered the family a gift, portraits that would preserve their memory forever, ensuring that no ancestor would be forgotten. The family, proud of their bloodline and fearful of being erased by time, accepted his offer. But the artist had made a deal with forces beyond the natural world. The portraits were not only paintings. They were vessels, binding the souls of the family to canvas. The diary revealed that this bond carried a terrible price. The portraits would preserve memory, but slowly, over time, they would begin to consume the lives they held. The fading was not a failure of paint. It was the slow erasure of existence. Eleonora felt her hands tremble as she read. She understood now why names had vanished from records, why belongings had lost meaning, and why Clara's portrait was turning transparent. The curse was not random. It was the result of a pact made long ago, a pact that had promised remembrance but had delivered destruction. She realized that her great-grandmother had known the truth but had chosen silence, perhaps out of fear or perhaps out of loyalty to the family's pride. The diary carried regret, words that spoke of sorrow for the generations that would suffer. Eleonora felt anger rise inside her, but she also felt clarity. The truth was now revealed, and she knew that the family could no longer hide from it. Thomas listened as Eleonora shared the discovery. His skepticism had already been broken by the fading of the portraits, but the diary gave him undeniable proof. He felt betrayed by the ancestors who had accepted such a dangerous pact. He realized that the family had lived for generations under the shadow of this curse, pretending that the portraits were symbols of honor while ignoring the truth of their power. Thomas felt guilt for his earlier denial, but he also felt determination. He knew that the family had to act, to break the bond before it erased them completely. The diary was not only a record of the past. It was a warning for the present. Clara, though weak from the fading of her own portrait, listened with fear and hope. She had always dreamed of freedom, but now she understood that her life was tied to the curse. The diary explained what she had felt in her heart. Her soul was bound to the canvas, and if the portrait disappeared, she would vanish too. Clara realized that her survival depended on the family's courage to face the truth. She felt sorrow for the ancestors who had chosen pride over safety, but she also felt strength. She knew that her life was not only her own. It was part of a chain that connected her to generations before her, and that chain had to be broken if she was to live freely. Eleonora found her great-grandmother's diary. It told that the portraits were created by an artist who made a deal with darkness to preserve the family. The price was slow erasure. The discovery of truth filled the Weiss family with fear, but it also gave them clarity. They understood now that the fading portraits were not only symbols of history but instruments of destruction. The curse was real, and the path ahead demanded courage. The family knew that they had to face the darkness, for only by uncovering the full story and confronting its power could they hope to survive. Chapter 6. The Final Trial. The Weiss family stood together in the long gallery of the estate, where the portraits of their ancestors lined the walls in heavy frames. The air was cold, and the silence carried a weight that pressed against their hearts. Eleonora Weiss looked at the fading faces with sorrow and determination. She had spent her life protecting the estate and the memory of her family, but now she understood that the portraits were not guardians. They were chains, binding the souls of the living to a curse that erased them slowly. She felt torn between her duty to preserve the past and her responsibility to protect the future. The choice before her was cruel, for destroying the portraits might free them from the curse, but it could also destroy the lives tied to the canvas. Thomas Weiss stood beside his sister, his skepticism long gone. He had once believed that the fading was only the result of time, but the evidence had broken his denial. He had seen names vanish from records, belongings lose meaning, and Clara's memory slip away. He now accepted that the portraits carried a dark power, born from the pact made generations ago. Thomas felt anger at the ancestors who had chosen pride over safety, but he also felt fear. He knew that destroying the portraits was dangerous, for the souls bound to them might vanish with the paint. Yet he also understood that keeping them meant surrendering to slow erasure. The trial was clear. They had to choose between memory and freedom, between the past and survival. Clara Weiss, though weakened by the fading of her own portrait, stood with courage. She had always dreamed of freedom, of life beyond the estate, but the curse had tied her to the walls of the house. She looked at her own portrait and saw her face turning transparent, her eyes fading into emptiness. She realized that if the portraits remained, she would vanish completely, forgotten by the world. Clara felt sorrow for the ancestors who had chosen this path, but she also felt strength. She knew that her life was not only her own. It was part of a chain that connected her to generations before her, and that chain had to be broken. She accepted that freedom carried risk, but she believed that living with courage was better than fading into silence. The family gathered in front of the largest portrait, the one that carried the image of the ancestor who had first accepted the artist's pact. The painting was almost gone, its colors weak, its face blurred into shadow. Eleonora felt the weight of decision pressing against her. She understood that destroying this portrait might end the curse, but it might also erase her own existence. She thought of her duty, of the years she had spent protecting the estate, and of the promise she had made to preserve the family's memory. Yet she also thought of Clara, of the future that was slipping away, and of the truth that memory was not in paint but in actions. Eleonora realized that the trial demanded sacrifice, and she felt ready to face it. The family decided to destroy the portraits, but they realized it could destroy them too. They had to choose: keep memory or break free from the curse. The final trial was not only about the paintings. It was about courage, honesty, and the willingness to let go of illusions. The Weiss family stood at the edge of destiny, knowing that their choice would decide whether they lived or vanished. The silence of the estate grew heavier, and the portraits seemed to watch them, waiting for the decision that would end the curse or bind them forever. Chapter 7. Resolution. The gallery of the Weiss estate stood in silence, its walls lined with fading portraits that had carried the family's pride for centuries. Eleonora Weiss walked slowly toward the largest painting, the one that held the image of the ancestor who had first accepted the artist's pact. At 36 years old, she had lived her life as the keeper of the estate, protecting its traditions and guarding its secrets. Yet now she understood that her duty was not to preserve the curse but to end it. She looked at the blurred face on the canvas and felt the weight of generations pressing against her. She knew that the only way to save her family was to destroy the portrait, even if it meant sacrificing herself. Eleonora accepted this truth with calm strength, for she believed that destiny was not built on shadows but on actions. Thomas Weiss stood beside his sister, his heart heavy with fear and sorrow. He had once been a skeptic, refusing to believe in supernatural forces, but the fading of the portraits had forced him to face the truth. At 40 years old, he carried regret for his denial, but he also carried determination. He wanted to protect his niece, Clara, and he wanted to honor his sister's courage. He watched as Eleonora raised her hand to the portrait, knowing that her choice would decide their fate. Thomas felt powerless, yet he understood that Eleonora's sacrifice was necessary. He realized that memory was not in paint or canvas. It was in the lives they lived, in the choices they made, and in the honesty they carried. Clara Weiss, though weakened by the fading of her own portrait, stood with tears in her eyes. At 18, she had dreamed of freedom, of life beyond the estate, but the curse had tied her to the walls of the house. She saw her aunt preparing to destroy the portrait and felt sorrow, for she knew that Eleonora's life would be lost. Yet she also felt hope, for she understood that her future depended on this act of courage. Clara realized that freedom was not given by dreams alone. It was earned through sacrifice and truth. She promised herself that if she survived, she would live with honesty, building her destiny not on illusions but on actions. Eleonora touched the portrait, and the canvas trembled as if alive. The colors dissolved, the frame cracked, and the image vanished into shadow. A wave of silence filled the gallery, heavy and final. Eleonora's body grew weak, and she fell, her life fading with the destruction of the painting. Thomas and Clara rushed to her side, but they knew that her sacrifice was complete. The curse had ended. The portraits around them lost their power, their fading stopped, and the bond that had tied the family to darkness was broken. Yet with the end of the curse came loss. Part of their past was erased, memories of ancestors vanished, and pieces of history were gone forever. Thomas and Clara survived, but they understood that their lives would never be the same. They accepted a new life without portraits, knowing that destiny was not built on images but on actions. The estate no longer carried the weight of cursed paintings. It carried the promise of freedom, the chance to live without fear of erasure. Clara felt hope for the future, and Thomas felt peace for the first time in years. They honored Eleonora's sacrifice by living with courage, remembering that true memory lived not in shadows but in deeds. Eleonora sacrificed herself, destroying the main portrait, and the curse ended. Thomas and Clara survived, but part of their past was lost. They accepted a new life without portraits, knowing that destiny was built not on images but on actions. Moral: the past is important, but it must not control the present. True memory lives in deeds and honesty, not in shadows and illusions. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.